Over a few years of playing Valheim, I have done quite a few playthroughs of the game. During each I tried to use different armor and weapon combos, do something I haven't done before, and as a result of that many different characters accrued. I like playing this way. Whenever I'm in the mood to switch gear, I can just switch to a different character instead. The inconvenience is just most of them inhabit different worlds, so sharing resources is a bit more complicated than it needs to be. Also, some of those worlds are as old as Valheim's early access itself. Lots have changed since, and many of those worlds are a little bit broken in one way or another. To solve those problems, I decided to move all of my characters into a single post-Ashlands generated world. The easiest thing to do would have been to just build one well-equipped base and be done with it. However, I like my characters to have their own homes. That becomes part of their identity. Also, having multiple bases scattered across the world makes that world a little bit more interesting in my opinion. And so I started building. I've done many large and small builds in Valheim survival mode, hence I am very familiar with how long it can take just to gather all the resources needed. This time I decided to skip that and do all the building in the Hammer Time mode. However, I do not use any mods, so all the structural integrity calculations are completely vanilla. Here are the results. Very close to the center of the world is the Meadhall, a place for all the Vikings to convene, drop off surplus resources, pick up stuff they are short on, and exchange map information. It's deliberately a very simple building, built mostly out of very basic materials. There are no defenses here, no blast furnaces, no Galder table. The environment is also deliberately kept as natural and untouched as was practical. It's a place to chill and relax, to remind of simpler times. It also has a dock, very basic too, yet large enough to park few bigger ships. The Meadhall is run by a character known as a pikeman. He's the only Viking in this particular world who uses a tower shield. His primary weapon is a spear, but he also uses one-handed sword when situation demands it. A little bit to the northeast of the Meadhall there's a place known as the Asksvins Grove. Probably the most compact base here. The place is inhabited by the character known as a Wild Rider. She uses only primal weapons and the stuff of the wild, so sort of a druid huntress type of a character. Also she breeds and rides Asksvins. For quite a while I couldn't figure out what kind of base would be a good fit for her. I thought about tree houses, caves, or even just taking over a Fulling village and using it as a base. One thing was clear, she had to have some sort of a pit for her Asksvins. And then I had this idea to just build a pit and a circular hut on top of it. While small, this is quite a complicated build because of the geometry, but I am quite happy with the result. The base doesn't have any means to smelt metals, bake food or brew mead. Luckily the Meadhall is just a short Asksvin ride away. Far to the east on the hill in the plains there's a place known as the Wind Farm. Here lives the swordmaster of this world, also known as the Stormbringer. While truly competent in battle, he's a farmer at heart. More than anything in this world he cares about are his crops. Hence the palisade around the whole base. A unique sight in this world. The house itself looks good enough from the outside, but it is a little bit too narrow and cramped on the inside than I intended. The view from this hilltop are truly scenic though. The river nearby provides an access to the high seas, but he tries to keep his sailing down to a minimum. A bit south from the wind farm there's a place known as the weather station. It is inhabited by a very eccentric character. He once wanted to be a wizard, but did not want to fight any Forsaken. So as a compromise he only defeated the Mother and managed to learn magic after just that. I did a whole video about it. For quite a while after that stunt, however, this character was sort of abandoned, as I did not know what differentiates it from any other generic magic user. With Asksvins update, few more magic options opened up and this character ended up using the Dunder as his primary weapon, which is different enough for me to sometimes want to play it. So I started building this base having quite a conventional wizard tower in mind. I hate building wizard towers. Mid-build it was getting all sorts of janky and I decided to just lean into that junk and go more for a steampunky mad scientist lab kind of a thing. Dunder is a little bit sort of a steampunky weapon after all. And I am glad I did. I like how it looks and the concept itself. Quite a landmark when sailing by. That shield generator, by the way, while it is there mostly for the vibe, actually proved to be very useful once when dealing with nearby Meadhall. Far away in the south, just before reaching the perilous waters of the Ashlands, there's a place called the Blood Port. One of my largest builds ever attempted. Also my first try to build something out of Growston. The character who lives here is a blood mage, as in he uses blood magic exclusively and relies on melee for direct damage. He happily lived in his own world on quite a nice base, but one day he got his hands on materials for making the bone throne. I really like how that throne looks, but having it in the core with cabin just seemed completely out of place. So that's how the idea for this build came to me. I envisioned a very long great hall with a throne at the end of it, and that's exactly what I built. The hall. The hall was fine, but from the outside the whole thing looked like some monastery, and the one built by some very poor monks. To improve the looks somewhat, I decided to add a couple of towers on the side, and one thing led to another, and this is the end result. Spent a lot of time on this. Behind the throne there is a stair leading to the dungeon. It's a very small dungeon. Originally it was a place to keep Aether refinery, but later I decided that the weather station should be the only place in this world capable of refining Aether. So I repurposed it as a treasure vault. Hopefully it will fill up someday. There are also a few rooms at the back of the building. Very small rooms. The towers also work as staircases leading on the top of the roof. Barely functional staircases. But since I don't have much business being on that roof, it is fine. The port portion is built mostly out of stone, or well, let's call them historic reasons. Let's leave it at that. But I like the look well enough. Somewhere in the western part of the world there's a cabin in the woods. One of the smallest and simplest of buildings here. The character who lives here doesn't care about any weapons but axes. Always did. And he lived in an almost identical log cabin in his original world. He liked that cabin and wasn't too fond of moving. But the Vikings had to do a lot of convincing that log cabins are not that hard to build and it can be done anywhere. Finally he caved. Still prefers to be left alone for the most part. He loves meat though, so can be seen hanging out in the Meadhall sometimes. Speaking of the most basic builds, there are two places in this world that can barely be called bases. One is deep in the mist where the character known as the Mist Witch dwells. She lives there and doesn't like ever leaving. Sometimes drops off excess seeker meat and royal jelly at the Meadhall, which other Vikings find to be very useful. Another somewhat similar character, a warlock known as the Firestarter, simply took over a charred fortress and started living there. Not much to say about that. However, the Vikings find his fortress very useful when they themselves want to quickly get to the Ashlands. And here's the Hammerhand, the architect and the builder of this world. The very first real base he ever built, which was incidentally the very first real base I ever built in Valheim, was in a way built around the carve boat. When he got his longship for the very first time, he could no longer comfortably dock with it there, so he started building a new port and a home around that ship. This is the base which is very dear to me to this day. Every stone that went into it was mined with an iron pickaxe over a course of a couple of weeks of way too long game sessions. I absolutely love it. So once the Hammerhand finished building all the homes for the others, it was time for him to build a new home for himself in this world. Continuing the tradition, he started building around the Drakkar. It's a ship. It's a very big ship. I was putting away this build for a long time. Was worrying that solving for structural integrity will lead to compromises too great for it to look any good. Also, while building into very steep slopes is an easy way to create something impressive because of the verticality, it also makes it a bit tricky to build exactly what you want. But in this case I liked the result a lot. Initially I was toying with the idea to use corewood to break out the stone, and it probably could work really well. But the way black marble plays off of the stone is very nice too. The place from now on is known as the Winterport. It's a pleasant place to be at, even when blizzards start. Except those kills the frame rate really bad. Also, it's the only place in this world that has and always will a full upgraded Black Forge. And this is where the story concludes. There are a couple of more ideas in the back of my head for different builds. Never built anything in the swamp, so that's something I want to try sometime. Maybe a few other things. But for now, this is it.